This is the Dover Download Podcast. My name is Christopher Parker, and for the past 25 years, I've had the pleasure of working with, learning from, and talking to a variety of volunteer, staff, and community members. This podcast explores conversations, activities, and a variety of policies and programs which exist here in Dover to improve the community in one way or another.
Well, I know everyone's expecting to hear Chris's voice first, but instead you're going to hear me, Mike Gillis, just a little bit as we do something a little different this week. Chris, welcome to your podcast.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Every once in a while, we have a topic that we want to discuss that makes sense to have Chris really get into detail about. So we thought for this week, with this topic, it would be good for Chris to really sort of dig into the details. That topic this week is the City Council's goals. Every 2 years, we have a municipal election in Dover, and we elect various officials, including the City Council. And one of their first tasks is to identify their goals for the coming 2 years. Chris, maybe before we get into the actual goals, can you talk a little bit about how that process begins once the council is seated and begins the process of identifying their goals?
Absolutely. In a lot of ways, it actually begins before they're seated, because once they are elected, the city manager organizes a orientation process. And there's a couple meetings that occur actually in December to walk them through what it will be like to be a counselor. And as you say, one of the most important things they need to think about is what they want to accomplish, what goals and objectives the council as a whole has. So in that orientation session, one of the things that Mike will do is review the previous goals so they have a foundation. And a lot of times there's not much turnover. We've historically had a pretty stable council over the past 20, 25 years. So there's institutional knowledge that comes with that new council. So what happens is in January on a Saturday, the department heads and the new council and a few other important key staff will meet for a session that is facilitated by an outside facilitator. And they will go through and talk about priorities. We'll talk about where we've had deficiencies and where we can excel. We'll review the accomplishments and the successes of the past councils, and we'll look at where the opportunities arise to either dig deeper or continue some of the successful plans that have been in the past. And it generally creates 6 or 7 goal areas that have specific targets beneath them, sort of objectives of that goal section. And then those notes and those goals will be summarized in a document that will be presented early February. And ironically, it was about a year ago, on February 14th, 2024, that the council adopted the goals. From there, what happens is at the monthly report that the city manager provides the city council, which if listeners haven't dove into that, it's a lengthy document. It's about 100 pages every month of activities and objectives that are quantified. Those goals and objectives are categorized by the council goals. So, for instance, one of them this year is our city has diverse housing. So each department will then provide Mike, who then provides the council, an update on what they've done to promote diverse housing throughout the community.
Before we get into the specific goals and having obviously participated in these goal-setting sessions, I think it's probably worth noting that these are comprehensive sessions, right? It's over the course of several hours on a Saturday, as you mentioned, and it's a pretty interesting process because it's sort of a process of elimination. They really work hard to identify what the most important goals for the next 2 years are through a detailed process of identifying just about everything that they would consider to be important or critical in the next 2 years.
Well, you and I have both been through quite a few of these at this point. And one of the things that strikes me most is the collaborative nature of it, and that it's the first opportunity the new council really has to work together. And there's both a formality to it and an informality to it. The council has a process they use. The facilitator walks them through throwing out ideas, reviewing those ideas, filtering those ideas. But at the same time, they really riff off each other a lot of times. And you break into smaller groups, and there's a back and forth that builds that collaborative nature, but it's respectful and it follows a process. I agree with you. It's a very detailed, but it's also a dynamic conversation.
It really is. And it's interesting to see, too, because every counselor may have their own individual priorities, although they have many shared goals. And that's what we find over the course of this process. Some of these individual goals come to the surface, and then they discover that some of them have the same shared goals. Right. And then some of them, sort of drop down the list a little bit because maybe they're not as high a priority as some of the others. But
what I like, too, is when you have the outside facilitator who can see commonalities and express to them, what if we rephrased it this way? Would both counselors or many counselors see that as a shared goal? So something that might not seem at the start to be linked to another objective really helps reinforce an overall goal.
As you mentioned, after the council finishes their goal-setting session, the council goals are then listed and presented back to the council, and then they vote on their goals for the next 2 years. So let's take a look at what the goals are that the council identified at their last goal-setting session.
Sure. So there are 7 overall goals. The first goal is our city has diverse housing, and that's described as a list of objectives that support Dover and have housing that is attainable and available to its residents. The second is our goal is civically engaged, and it lists objectives that will ensure the public is part of the community's governance and has multiple channels for providing feedback. We want to have a governance that is not just top-down, that is certainly representative, but also democratic. Third goal is our city is resilient, and this has objectives that ensure a social, built, and natural infrastructure that's all designed to evolve and support our community needs. The fourth one is our city is safe and inviting, and the objectives here ensure that the city's infrastructure and environment is welcoming. The fifth is our city is inclusive and welcoming, and this is about supporting Dover in a welcoming manner, no matter what your socioeconomic background is. 6 is our city has sustainable financial policies, and these objectives ensure the city's financial health is stable and open for all to view and understand. And then finally, the 7th is our opportunities are accessible for all. So these objectives support a Dover that is inviting, has inviting public spaces, and is available for people to live in, work in, or visit. This is sort of a catch-all. We want to make sure that everyone feels welcome, regardless if they're a resident or a visitor.
Once the goals are identified and adopted, it's not that they're just sitting on a shelf somewhere. I mean, we just gave a quick overview of what the goals are, but there's a lot behind the scenes that happens to try and fulfill or at least move these goals along. So you talked a little bit earlier about the city manager's report as one example of how we continue to update the council and the community on the progress that's being made toward these goals. What other ways do we inform the council and the community about the progress that's being made to try and fulfill or at least further along these goals?
So I think it's in 2 ways. The first is certainly during the budget presentations, whether it's the budget that is actually presented in line with these goals, which certainly there's a quick turnaround on that. But then a year later, there's a little bit more refinement, and we can take a look at that. The second, I think, is working with the various boards, committees, and commissions to also understand the goals and objectives and their role, because it's not just the council dictating to staff or staff providing answers. It is a real roll-up-the-sleeves effort, and I think the volunteer base through our boards, committees, and commissions also plays a role. Certainly the housing one, you have the ad hoc housing committee that was set up, but there are other areas. The resiliency one, we know the Energy Commission, the Conservation Commission, the Open Lands Committee has had a role. The Rec Advisory Committee has a broad role. There are these different boards, committees, and commissions that get engaged, and through their actions, we move these goals forward. And certainly the council reviews them at their own meetings, and they discuss them and support them. It has to be a all-inclusive process. It can't be here are our goals, go and initiate them for us. The council needs to be just as accountable as the boards, commissions, committees, and the staff are.
That's great to point out because it isn't just what's happening with city staff and the council sort of taking a look from time to time at what progress is being made. This is sort of a community-wide effort. And it's good that you mentioned our public bodies, our boards, commissions, and committees, because there's a lot of work that goes on.
One of the things that I think is important to talk about is I read the goals, and they are umbrella goals, right? Our city has diverse housing. You could throw 100 darts at that and not have the same location. That's when we need to drill down, and through the strategic plans that the departments have, through our operating budget, through our master plan, all of these things sort of come together to work towards those goals, and they all reflect an integrated reality.
From an overview, these are somewhat generalized, but what's interesting is that, every few years, there are some goals that remain consistent that are either goals that will continue with each successive council because it's something the council wants to see consistently.
Yeah. There are some ideas that we always want to make sure happen, that we have civil discourse, that we're not complaining and fighting with each other.
And work continues to be made in those areas. But part of this process too identifies occasionally new goals that reflect sort of where we are with the community. And housing is a great example of that. It certainly is something that has come up in the past, but now it's sort of worked its way up to the top almost of the goals identified by the council. And it's something we've obviously talked about quite a bit on this podcast as well, too, because it is something that everybody is really trying to address.
And at the same time, there are goals and objectives that you and I can remember that have been met or are being met. One of the ones that was perennially on the list was develop the waterfront. And so that one, while it's not 100% complete, it is underway enough that I don't think you need to see it on goal and objective anymore because the council is confident that it is occurring. One of the things that I think has been interesting observing these is the maturity and the evolution of these goals. And that's come with some consistency on the council. But it's also come with the trust that's been built between the council and staff. I remember attending my first one, and the staff were at a different table, and we were there as a resource only to be spoken to, not to be spoken with. And that certainly is different. There's more trust. The manager has done an amazing job of building a direct relationship with the council. Still there's separation, and still there is we are the policymakers and we are the administration, but it is much less an us and them, and it's really a we conversation.
And it's a conversation that continues also internally because the department heads constantly, reiterated that these are goals that we need to work on continually, right?
Right. I think that's a great point that what public might not be aware of is that every 2 weeks, senior management meets and we review certainly what's going on in our day-to-day operations, but we are constantly reviewing these goals, the master plan goals, the values that we have as an organization, and make sure that those are still part of our ongoing operations, whether they are asked about at a daily rate or if they're in the background, they are the foundation.
And maybe you can talk a little bit about how the city council's goals align with, you mentioned the master plan, certainly, and our strategic plan. Because as you know, in the coming weeks, we're going to begin budget deliberations, which we will spend a lot of time discussing on this podcast in the coming weeks. But we're going to hear more about these council goals, too, as departments begin to make their budget presentations, because the budgets they're proposing, in many cases, will address some of these goals.
So the budget is the most important policy that the council adopts. And as part of that, it should be effectuating the goals, objectives of the council, the master plan, and our strategic plans. So we use a strategic framework here that thinks long-term and acts immediately. And I mean that in the sense that we have broad range goals, but we break them into chunks that how are we going to address these in the coming weeks, months, years, but also in the long term. So each department every 5 years puts together a operating strategic plan. And then annually we review those, and we review them in the framework of we have a budget to put together. How are we addressing and moving these forward in the proposed budget? Do we need staff? Do we need resources? Do we need to purchase something? Do we need equipment that we don't have? So in those ways, when you present your budget, the manager asks that you say, one of the reasons why I'm asking for this increase, or one of the reasons why I want to purchase X, is because it will facilitate the following goal or objective, whether it's a council goal, a master plan goal, or a strategic plan goal. It shouldn't just be, yeah, I'd like to spend some money. There needs to be some oomph behind it, and that oomph should be a strategic thought, a strategic plan.
Now, we didn't obviously get into a lot of the details of each of these goals. There's a lot of information that is presented every single month. You mentioned the city manager's report. There's just an enormous amount of information that articulates the work that's being done to address these goals, but not only the city council's goals, the master plan, certainly, and the strategic plan. How can people, if they want to sort of follow along and see the progress that's being made and get these updates, where can they get this information?
So I think there's two main areas. If you go on the city's website to the city council page, you can see the goals. And then you can also see there's a link to the manager's report. At the same time, if you go to the city manager's webpage, the executive department lists the strategic plan, and they're also cross-referenced there. So you can reach his reports from that page, or you can follow them through the strategic plan, city goals, master plan page. A final thing I would say is you can sign up for the Dover download. You're listening to the podcast iteration, but the newsletter iteration has a lot of the accomplishments that we've achieved, and also links to when council meetings are having, what those agendas are. And through the agenda link, you can get to the same information. We try to, I think, be redundant where it's positive, because we want to make sure that we're getting the word out as much as possible. So those are the main ways I would say. But the other thing is, whether it's your counselor, the city manager, or a department head, we all have email. We're all very accessible, I think. And so I would suggest, if you have a specific goal or objective you want an update on and you don't want to weed through things, send an email to Mike Joyle and say, can you update me on the following? Can you provide me with some guidance? Send an email to your counselor or the mayor or one of the at-large counselors. Send an email to me or you. And we're happy to provide information. There's no stone wall. We look at it as a great opportunity to provide that insight.
And also, just to note briefly, part of these updates include the occasional workshop, too, with the city council. And I thought maybe we briefly mention that, we just had one of those where planning director Donna Benton and one of our city planners, Aaron Basagio, made a presentation to the council just last week on the master plan and updates to the master plan.
Absolutely. So the week before the budget is released, I would say going on 15 years, the planning director has presented to the city council what our master plan is, what was accomplished in the year before, and like this year, when there is a chapter that has recently been approved by the planning board, someone on staff will review what the content of that was. So as you mentioned, Erin, who's a frequent contributor on this podcast, she was on the dais the other night discussing the open space and conservation chapter of the master plan, which was recently adopted by the planning board. And the other thing she went through was what the land use chapter, which is the next chapter to be updated, what's the process for that. That one I kind of chuckled at, because when I started here in 1997, the first thing I worked on was that land use chapter of the master plan, and then was involved with the 2007 and the 2015 version. So in a good way, we're finally moving to one that I'm not going to be the direct staff for. So that's going to be exciting for me to see what the land use chapter will hold. It is one that has a lot of policy implication because it really talks to our economic development, our housing, and our general growth patterns.
Anything else, Chris, you think we should share about the city council's goals or other strategic goals before we depart?
I think I would just reiterate that we should champion the fact, and I think the manager and the mayor do, that we're a community that is strategically poised. We don't react. We try to proactively address things, and we try to think through implications. So the goals and objectives are a good part of that. Having the council sit down early in its term and say, here's what we want to accomplish, and then not just say 2 years later, hey, how'd we do? But look at them on a monthly basis and reflect on those, and then iterate where it needs to iterate, I think is an important part of the community's success and vibrancy.
All right. Well, Chris, thanks for joining us on your podcast today.
Where else would I be?
Where else would you be? Exactly. So look forward to doing this again when the topic arises.
We'll be back in a year when the new council has been seated and has created its new goals.
All right. Sounds good. All right. Well, have a great day.
You too. Dover has a wealth of history in its over 400 years of existence. Coming up, Mike Gillis is going to share some of that history with us.
On February 14, 1910, Dover's Marilla Ricker announced her candidacy for Governor of New Hampshire. She said she would stump in every city and town in the state. Who was Marilla Ricker? Marilla Ricker was a prominent figure in the women's rights movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Born in New Hampshire in 1841, Ricker was a passionate advocate for women's suffrage and equal rights throughout her life. Despite facing opposition from many quarters, she persisted in her efforts to empower women and fight for their rights, eventually becoming one of the most influential women's rights activists of her time. Marilla Ricker was born into a family of modest means, but her parents instilled in her a strong work ethic and a commitment to social justice. As a young woman, she received a solid education, attending schools in New Hampshire and later in Massachusetts. Shortly after she finished college, she married John Ricker, a wealthy farmer from Dover. When he died in 1868, Marilla became a very wealthy widow. In the late 1870s, Marilla Ricker became increasingly involved in the women's suffrage movement. She was inspired by the speeches and writings of prominent suffrage advocates such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and was determined to do her part to help secure the right to vote for women. In 1870, she was the first woman in New Hampshire to attempt to vote. She handed in a ballot at the polls in Dover's Ward 3 that year, but was denied by the city clerk. For the remainder of her life, she tried to convince the legislature and the people of New Hampshire that women deserved the right to vote. To demonstrate that women deserve the same rights as men, she paid her taxes in Dover in protest every year. Over the next several decades, Marilla Ricker became a tireless advocate for women's rights. She traveled extensively, giving speeches and participating in protests, and worked tirelessly to raise awareness about the issue. Despite much opposition, she persisted in her efforts and became one of the most well-known and respected women's rights activists of her time. In 1890, Ricker was the first woman to apply for admission to the New Hampshire bar, opening the door to the bar for other women. The following year, in 1891, she was admitted to the bar of the Supreme Court of the United States. Throughout her career, Marilla Ricker made numerous significant contributions to the women's rights movement. Perhaps most notably, she was a founding member of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which played a critical role in the fight for women's suffrage. Marilla Ricker was also an influential writer and speaker. She wrote extensively about women's rights and the need for women to have the right to vote, and her speeches were widely read and quoted. Her words inspired countless women to get involved in the suffrage movement, and her tireless advocacy helped to build momentum for the cause. Marilla Ricker continued to be active in the women's rights movement until her death in 1920. She was widely recognized for her contributions to the cause, and her legacy continues to inspire women today. In 2016, a portrait of Marilla Ricker was hung at the New Hampshire Statehouse, following a fundraising campaign by the League of Women Voters of New Hampshire and the New Hampshire Women's Bar Association. The portrait honors the life and legacy of a trailblazing woman who dedicated her life to causes of justice, equality, and human rights.
Thanks for listening to the Dover Download this week. If you like what you heard, subscribe through your favorite podcast aggregator. And if you have something you want to hear a topic on, let us know. Finally, this is just one of the many ways we share information about the city of Dover. You can subscribe to the Dover Downloads email newsletter every week or other newsletters that we have by going to the City of Dover homepage, www.dover.nh.gov. Have a great week.